Your mind is already creating reasons to click away from this video. Carl Jung discovered why. There are certain truths about spiritual awakening that your ego desperately doesn't want you to know, not because they're negative, but because understanding them would change everything about how you approach your journey. These are the revelations Jung believed people needed most, but resisted most strongly. Today I'm sharing 5 spiritual awakening revelations from Jung that you'll want to skip, but absolutely shouldn't. Your resistance to hearing them is precisely why you need to. Because Jung discovered that what we avoid knowing about awakening is exactly what would accelerate our transformation. Here's what Jung understood. The psyche protects itself from truths that would require fundamental change. Every revelation I'm about to share will trigger what Jung called psychological resistance. Your mind creating reasons why this doesn't apply to you, why you should watch something else, why you already know this. That resistance is your ego's defense against transformation. The stronger you feel it, the more you need to hear what's coming. The first revelation is why most people never truly begin. You're using spiritual awakening to avoid life. Jung discovered something that nobody wants to admit. Most spiritual seeking is actually sophisticated avoidance. You're not pursuing awakening. You're fleeing from the difficult work of being human. The meditation, the workshops, the endless seeking for the next teaching. Jung called this spiritual escapism, and he believed it was the biggest obstacle to genuine transformation. Here's what Jung observed. People turn to spirituality not to engage more deeply with life, but to escape its demands. Relationships are difficult. Seek transcendence beyond human connection. Career feels meaningless. Pursue enlightenment instead of finding meaningful work. Personal problems feel overwhelming. Focus on cosmic consciousness rather than practical solutions. Jung wrote, "The Western mind often uses Eastern spirituality as an escape from Western responsibilities. But individuation happens through life, not despite it. Every avoided human challenge is an avoided opportunity for genuine transformation." This spiritual bypassing manifests in specific patterns Jung documented extensively. You meditate for hours but avoid difficult conversations with family. You read endless spiritual books, but never apply the insights to daily life. You seek peak experiences while neglecting basic responsibilities. You pursue ego death while refusing to develop a healthy ego first. You talk about unconditional love while being unable to maintain ordinary relationships. What makes this particularly challenging to recognize is that it feels noble. Seeking enlightenment seems more important than dealing with mundane problems. Pursuing transcendence appears more spiritual than engaging with ordinary life. But Jung discovered this is exactly backward. True spiritual development happens through conscious engagement with life's challenges, not escape from them. Jung identified what he called the spiritualization defense, using spiritual concepts to avoid psychological work. Instead of facing your anger, you spiritual bypass it with forced compassion. Rather than acknowledging selfishness, you reframe it as self-care. Instead of dealing with relationship problems, you decide you need to work on yourself in isolation. Every spiritual concept becomes a tool for avoidance rather than engagement. The revelation that you might be using awakening to avoid life is particularly threatening because it questions the entire framework you've built. If your spiritual practice is actually avoidance, then years of seeking might have been sophisticated procrastination. This is why your ego wants you to skip this. It threatens the comfortable narrative that seeking equals progress. Jung's insight was that genuine awakening requires what he called conscious suffering, fully engaging with life's difficulties rather than transcending them. This means facing the job you hate and either transforming it or leaving it consciously. Dealing with relationship challenges rather than retreating into spiritual solitude. Engaging with financial responsibilities rather than dismissing them as unspiritual. The truth Jung discovered is that life itself is the spiritual path. Every challenge is a teacher. Every responsibility is a practice. Every human difficulty is an opportunity for consciousness expansion. But this requires engaging with life more fully, not less. The mystic who can't maintain a job or relationship isn't enlightened. They're avoiding the very experiences that would create genuine transformation. Jung emphasized that this doesn't mean abandoning spiritual practice, but grounding it in life engagement. Meditation becomes preparation for conscious daily life, not escape from it. Spiritual insights get tested in relationships and work. Transcendent experiences inform practical decisions. The spiritual and material unite rather than oppose each other. But even when we stop using spirituality as escape, there's another revelation we resist. Your suffering is mostly self-created. Jung discovered a truth that people desperately avoid. Most of your suffering isn't happening to you. You're creating it through unconscious patterns, projections, and resistance. This isn't about blame, but about recognizing your power to stop creating unnecessary pain. Your ego doesn't want you to know this because it would mean taking responsibility for your experience. Here's what Jung observed through decades of analytical work. People unconsciously create the very suffering they claim to want to escape. They choose partners who trigger their wounds, create situations that confirm their fears, and maintain patterns that perpetuate their pain. This isn't masochism. It's what Jung called unconscious repetition compulsion, the psyche's attempt to heal through recreation. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Most of what people experience as external suffering is actually internal patterns projected outward. This self-creation of suffering manifests in recognizable patterns Jung documented. You repeatedly attract the same type of problematic relationships, then blame bad luck rather than examining your selection pattern. You create drama and conflict while believing you want peace. You sabotage success, then feel victimized by failure. You maintain thoughts that create anxiety while wondering why you're anxious. What makes this revelation so difficult to accept is that suffering feels imposed from outside. That difficult person seems to be the cause of your stress. That challenging situation appears to be creating your struggle. But Jung discovered that we unconsciously seek out and create circumstances that match our internal state. The outer world reflects the inner condition. Jung identified specific mechanisms of self-created suffering. Projection makes you see in others what you refuse to see in yourself, creating conflict that's actually internal. Shadow denial causes you to attract people who embody your rejected aspects, creating relationships that force confrontation with disowned parts. Unconscious patterns from childhood get recreated in adult life, not as punishment, but as attempts at resolution. The revelation of self-created suffering is threatening because it removes the comfort of victimhood. If you're creating your suffering, you can't blame others, circumstances, or fate. This responsibility feels overwhelming, which is why the ego prefers to maintain the illusion of external causation. But Jung emphasized this is actually empowering. If you're creating your suffering, you can stop creating it. This doesn't mean you control everything. Genuine external challenges exist. But Jung estimated that most psychological suffering is internally generated and therefore internally resolvable. The key is what Jung called taking back projections, recognizing that what triggers you in others lives in you. That person who infuriates you with their arrogance, they're showing you your own disowned pride. That situation that keeps repeating, you're unconsciously creating it to resolve something. That suffering that seems imposed, you're maintaining it through resistance to what is. Jung's approach wasn't to eliminate all suffering, but to distinguish necessary from unnecessary suffering. Necessary suffering comes from genuine loss, growth, and life's inherent challenges. Unnecessary suffering comes from resistance, projection, and unconscious patterns. Most people experience far more unnecessary than necessary suffering. Yet even recognizing self-created suffering isn't the most challenging revelation. You don't actually want to awaken. This is Jung's most confronting revelation. Despite all your seeking, reading, and practicing, part of you actively resists awakening, not just fears it, actively prevents it. Jung called this the ego's investment in sleep, and he believed recognizing this resistance was essential for genuine transformation. Here's what Jung discovered. The ego knows that genuine awakening means its dethronement. It will no longer be the center of your psychological universe. Its desires won't drive your decisions. Its fears won't control your choices. So, while you consciously seek awakening, your ego unconsciously sabotages it through subtle but powerful means. Jung wrote, "The seeker who cannot find is often the one who doesn't truly want to find." The ego is terrified of awakening because awakening means the ego's relativization. So, it creates endless seeking that never quite arrives. This resistance manifests in clever ways Jung identified. You pursue awakening through methods that ensure you won't achieve it. Intellectual study without practice or practice without integration. You seek teachers who confirm your beliefs rather than challenge them. You find reasons to leave just when breakthrough approaches. You create drama and distraction whenever you get close to real change. What's particularly revealing is the pattern of almost but not quite. You meditate but stop just before deep states. You do shadow work but avoid the really difficult parts. You approach ego death but pull back at the crucial moment. This isn't failure, it's the ego's successful defense against transformation. Jung identified what he called comfortable seeking. Maintaining just enough spiritual practice to feel you're progressing without actually threatening the ego's dominance. You read about awakening rather than pursuing it. You think about consciousness rather than expanding it. You discuss transformation rather than experiencing it. The ego creates what Jung called substitute satisfactions, experiences that feel spiritual but don't actually transform, peak experiences that don't integrate, insights that don't change behavior, spiritual highs that don't alter daily life. These substitutes satisfy the conscious desire for awakening while protecting the ego from actual change. This revelation is particularly difficult because it questions your entire spiritual identity. If you don't actually want to awaken, what have you been doing all these years? This is exactly why your ego wants you to skip this. It threatens the narrative of being a sincere seeker. Jung observed that people often spend decades in what he called preparatory circling, always preparing for transformation without actually transforming. One more book, workshop, or practice before you're ready. But the preparation never ends because the ego ensures you never feel quite prepared enough. The key to working with this resistance is what Jung called conscious acknowledgement, recognizing and accepting that part of you doesn't want to awaken. This isn't failure, but honesty. When you acknowledge the resistance, you can work with it rather than being unconsciously controlled by it. As challenging as this revelation is, there's another that cuts even deeper. If you're feeling resistance to these revelations, if part of you wants to stop watching, dismiss these insights, or argue against them, that's exactly what Jung predicted. The stronger your resistance, the more these truths apply to you. Before we explore the final 2 revelations that might change everything, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share in the comments which revelation you most want to reject. That resistance points to your greatest growth opportunity. Now, these last 2 revelations reveal why Jung believed most people never complete the awakening journey. Your spiritual experiences mean less than you think. Jung discovered something that challenges every spiritual seeker. Those peak experiences, mystical states, and transcendent moments you treasure, they mean far less than you believe. Jung called this the inflation of the numinous, overvaluing spiritual experiences while undervaluing the integration work that actually transforms. Here's what Jung observed. People have profound spiritual experiences, visions, unity consciousness, ego dissolution, and believe they've achieved something permanent. But Jung discovered these experiences are just openings, not achievements. What matters isn't the experience, but what you do with it. Most people have the experience and stop there, believing the experience itself was the transformation. Jung wrote, "The numinous experience is merely the beginning, not the end. What matters is the long, difficult work of integrating what was revealed." But most people collect experiences like trophies while avoiding the real work of integration. This overvaluation manifests in specific patterns Jung documented. People chase peak experiences like addicts seeking highs, believing more experiences equal more awakening. They tell stories of their spiritual experiences repeatedly, living in the past rather than integrating the present. They compare experiences competitively, as if awakening were measured in mystical moments. What makes this particularly problematic is that focusing on experiences actually prevents integration. While you're seeking the next high, you're not integrating the last insight. While you're comparing experiences, you're not embodying wisdom. While you're telling stories of past openings, you're not present to current opportunity. Jung identified what he called spiritual materialism, collecting spiritual experiences like material possessions. That meditation where you felt oneness becomes a trophy. That vision of light becomes a badge. That moment of ego death becomes your identity. But Jung discovered that people with the most dramatic experiences often showed the least actual transformation. The revelation that your spiritual experiences mean less than you think is threatening, because these experiences often form your spiritual identity. They're proof you're special, evolved, or chosen. To recognize they're just experiences, meaningful but not transformative in themselves, deflates the ego's spiritual inflation. Jung emphasized that what transforms isn't the experience but the integration. That moment of unity consciousness means nothing if you return to separation in daily life. That ego death is meaningless if the ego reconstitutes unchanged. That divine love experience is empty if you can't love ordinary humans. Integration, Jung discovered, is unglamorous work that the ego resists. It means changing actual behavior, not just having insights. It means embodying wisdom in challenging situations, not just in meditation. It means living differently, not just experiencing differently. The key is what Jung called experience as doorway, not destination. Understanding that spiritual experiences are invitations to transformation, not transformation itself. The experience opens a door. You still have to walk through it and live in the new room. But there's one final revelation that your ego really doesn't want you to hear. You're already awake, but pretending to sleep. Jung's final revelation is the most radical. You're not actually seeking awakening. You're maintaining the pretense of sleep. Deep down, beneath all the seeking and struggling, you already know who you are. You're already conscious. You're already whole. But you're invested in pretending otherwise because being asleep feels safer than taking responsibility for being awake. Here's what Jung discovered in his deepest explorations. What we call awakening isn't acquiring something new, but stopping the pretense of not knowing what we already know. The self, your true nature, has always been present, always been conscious, always been whole. The entire drama of seeking is the ego's elaborate avoidance of this simple truth. Jung wrote, "The tragic comedy of individuation is that we spend years seeking what we already are, knowing what we already know, becoming what we've always been. The seeking itself is the final defense against finding." This pretense of sleep manifests in subtle ways Jung identified. You ask questions you already know the answers to, seeking external validation for internal knowing. You look for teachers to tell you what your inner wisdom already whispers. You seek permission to be who you already are. You wait for awakening when you're already awake, but pretending not to notice. What makes this revelation so difficult is that it invalidates the entire seeking project. If you're already awake, then all the searching, suffering, and struggling has been unnecessary. This is such a threat to the ego's narrative that it creates elaborate arguments against this simple truth. Jung observed that people often have moments where they recognize this truth, sudden clarity that they've always known, always been whole, always been conscious. But then the ego quickly covers this recognition with doubt, telling stories about how awakening must be more complex, more difficult, more distant. The pretense of sleep serves what Jung called the ego's terror of responsibility. If you're already awake, you're responsible for living as who you truly are. You can't hide behind seeking. You can't postpone with preparation. You can't avoid with the excuse of not knowing. This responsibility feels overwhelming, so maintaining the illusion of sleep feels safer. Jung identified specific ways people maintain the pretense, creating complex philosophies about awakening that obscure simple truth, seeking increasingly esoteric teachings to avoid obvious wisdom, manufacturing spiritual crises to avoid spiritual responsibility, and maintaining the identity of seeker to avoid being finder. The revelation that you're already awake but pretending to sleep is the ultimate threat to the ego because it removes all excuses. No more seeking to hide behind. No more ignorance to claim. No more unconsciousness to blame. Just the simple, terrifying, liberating truth that you already are what you seek. Jung's approach to this wasn't to force recognition, but to gently point toward what's already known. He understood that people wake from pretend sleep when they're ready to handle the responsibility of being awake. The entire individuation journey is really just the process of admitting what you've always known. Here are Jung's 5 revelations you wanted to skip. You're using spirituality to void life. Your suffering is mostly self-created. You don't actually want to awaken. Your spiritual experiences mean less than you think, and you're already awake but pretending to sleep. Jung wrote, "The truth that transforms is always the truth we resist. What we most need to know is what we least want to hear. The revelation that would free us is the one we flee from." These revelations share a common thread. They all remove comfortable excuses and reveal uncomfortable responsibility. You can't blame life for your avoidance. You can't blame others for your suffering. You can't blame the universe for your resistance. You can't rest on past experiences. You can't hide in seeking what you already are. Jung understood that hearing these truths creates what he called productive discomfort, the necessary disturbance that precedes genuine change. The ego's resistance to these revelations is actually confirmation of their importance. What we resist reveals where we need to grow. But Jung also understood compassion for this resistance. The ego's defenses exist for good reasons. The avoidance protected you from overwhelming responsibility. The suffering gave meaning to difficulty. The resistance maintained identity. The experiences provided hope. The pretense offered safety. The invitation isn't to violently overthrow these defenses, but to gently acknowledge them. Yes, I use spirituality to avoid. Yes, I create suffering. Yes, I resist awakening. Yes, I overvalue experiences. Yes, I pretend not to know. This acknowledgement without judgment is what Jung called the beginning of real transformation. If you made it through all 5 revelations, if you didn't skip despite the resistance, you've already demonstrated the courage Jung believed was essential for genuine awakening. The willingness to hear unwanted truth is the beginning of transformation. Remember Jung's words, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." These revelations are terrifying because they demand complete self-acceptance, including accepting your avoidance, your self-creation, your resistance, your inflation, and your pretense. Subscribe and hit the notification bell for more uncomfortable truths that catalyze genuine change. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.